Friends, very happy evening to all of you. I welcome you all to this day 2 of the refresher course conducted along with committee of members in practice. In fact, we could not have Prasanna sir joining in. In fact, that is the kind of activities involved in. You could not come out of one of the important meetings. But nevertheless, we carry on with the concluding day, a very, very important topic, internal audits, for which we have with us G Shankar, one of the most renowned speakers when it comes to internal audit. Probably after you listen to him, you will appreciate what I'm trying to tell. In fact, we are very, very fortunate to have him with us, and he'll be sharing with us just not the theory, but also the practical side of internal audit. As to the A to Z of internal audit is what he said just before some time. So before I request the speaker to speak, I will request CA Sundarajan, a regional council member, to share his thoughts and also introduce the speaker formally. Sundarajan sir, over to you.
Namaskaram, sir.
Thank you.
Respected Regional Council Chairman, G Jain sir, respected Speaker of the Day, Mr. Shankar sir, and other persons who have joined this program. Welcome you all. This program, I think I'm heading the Internal Audit Committee as the chairman of the committee. I think you have given me that program now. Thank you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. This internal audit, I think, has not reached the people to the extent it is expected of. Yeah, this I can say, because everybody is lining up for statutory audits and bank audits and other audits, but they are not asking for internal audits. Because I started my career and I was in around 92 or 93. I was doing only internal audits. So I was given the I have left certain internal audits because they have asked me to give only the report. They have not followed it to the report, but they promptly paid the fees. So I told them that I'm not here just to give the report alone. I need some follow-up from the clients also. So I left that order, left those audits. And today, of course, those people are even one of them became a central minister later. That time he was not there, but later he even became central minister. But why I'm saying is that internal audit has got remunerative to the people. That has to be highlighted, sir. These people are our people are not accepting that. So that is remunerative. It is recurring. Every month you get some money. That is the internal audit one. Second thing is they should be prepared for the internal audit. Their programs. I think Institute Guidelines has issued a lot of programs for each type of audits, and even some writers have given, like as you said, you have given some write-ups. You have given there are a lot of write-ups, and the people can be much. It can be much useful to the people who are utilizing this opportunity to earn as well as to grow. Yeah, this I think you should be my introduction speech. Now I would like to introduce the speaker of the day, Mr. G Shankar. He is an audit practitioner with an overall experience of 39 years in diverse industry sectors and professional practice. He spent his initial career in accounting, treasury, and corporate finance, and then specialized in internal audit. He retired as Group Executive President, Corporate Audit from the Aditya Birla Group, a $4 billion Indian multinational pyramid, where he led the internal audit activity for a majority of global business, including metals, carbon black, cement, and telecommunication across multiple geographies. His overall exposure includes chemical, oil, pharmaceutical, electrical engineering, retail, mining, and BPO. I think this is where we can also see the varieties. As an internal auditor, you can see varieties, and it will give us a lot of experience also. A chartered accountant, certified internal auditor, and a certified information system auditor, Sri Shankar, completed the requirements of the ICAI qualification in internal audit leadership program. He is also trained as a performance coach. He has served as a director on the board of Global Institute of Internal Auditors for 2 years and as a member of the Global IAA Audit Committee. He also served in various IAA internal committee since 2004, the Professional Issues Committee and the International Internal Audit Standard Board. He currently serves a 3-year term from 2019 to 22 as a member of Global IAA Professional Certification Board. He speaks regularly at conferences and conducts training programs on a variety of topics related to the technical and behavioral aspects of internal audit, risk management, governance, and fraud. He authored a book titled A Handbook of Internal Audit, a guidance to corporate directorates and executive management, the second edition of which was published in 2020 by the Institute of Directors of India. This has got a lot of scope. This work, internal audit has got a lot of this. I think more people will come and join this internal audit and they'll take up more internal audit. Thank you, sir. I welcome you and the dice is yours.
Thank you,
thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Screen is all yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much, both Mr. Jain and Mr. Sundararajan. I hope I'm audible and you're
yes,
able
sir.
to listen to me. That's good. That's good. I think overall, I must say that I'm very happy that to be here with under SIRC. Although I had a very short stint in Cochin, which is under your organization. But SIRC is in Chennai. I know it's a Nungambakam Road. And I remember before I joined the CA course, after my graduation, I used to walk past Nungambakam Road and look at the SIRC office and always wondered whether I would become a chartered accountant or not, because that was my ambition in life. But because I had economics background, it was very difficult for me to immediately get. But then in Bombay, I was lucky to get articleship in Sharpen Tannen, and then the rest is history of what really happened. But the fact that I am a science student, went into economics, and then did CA without coaching, I think it speaks volumes for our tenacity more than anything else. I'm indeed, of course, very happy to address all the attendees here. So the way, let me share my screen and probably tell you what I'm going to speak about. Mr. Jain did mention to me that most of you are practicing accountants. And as Mr. Sundararajan rightly said, these are good times. There is a lot of things down there. And I think to a large extent, regulation paves the way for more business. And now that internal audit is mandatory even in private companies, actually it opens the doors, beyond SEBI. SEBI is a very small number, but the Companies Act has really opened the doors because they strongly believe that internal audit is going to help in good governance. So let me share my slide. I don't know, is it visible to you?
It is visible, sir. You can put in the full screen mode actually.
Yes.
Now
is it okay?
Now. Yes, great,
okay.
Sir, great.
So let me just share. So one of the, it's an interesting thing that I do is when I start, I make a disclaimer to say that sometimes I draw on individuals, I draw on companies to further expand my point. And so I'm doing that only for the purpose of creating awareness and understanding. So there is no intention to discredit or defame any person or organization. I think this is an important disclaimer. Now that we're also speaking about risk management, I think this is very, very important. So this is something that I wanted to just state at the outset. Now, what I'm going to speak about is we will talk about the VUCA world. Maybe many of you may not have heard what the VUCA world is all about, but I will let you know, give you a hindsight about it, and then talk about three separate sections in my presentation. First is about the internal audit. How is it that an internal auditor is part of the governance system? Thereafter, we will look at risk management. And then finally, we will look at what does it make an auditor to be really effective. And from that perspective, what is it that a practicing chartered accountant has to do? So this may not be all the things that is possible, but these are basically pointers to tell us, where somebody should direct their attention or focus their attention. So let me start with the VUCA world. The VUCA world, actually, the VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think that's where we are today. And I thought this background, I think we must all have to say that we are living in a very, very different world. We are highly connected. There is no doubt about it. But the fact is that in this world, a lot of things that are happening, which is relating to political changes, whether it is the United States. I still recall when Mr. Trump came in 2016, we saw that in some of our companies in the US as an emerging risk because of stated policies. And I'm sure there are many IT companies in India would have felt the pinch because of certain political statements that was made and which later became law. So political changes also drives business. And to that extent, I think it's an important factor that happens in the business environment. Then you also have the macroeconomic factors, which we all know, the GDP, the growth rate. And today we find that when the growth rate is less, the Sensex is higher. So it is very difficult to relate or correlate some of these aspects. But this is an important aspect to say what will be the macroeconomic factors that is going to drive or be responsible or to some extent relate to our business. And the business itself there is phenomenal changes in the business landscape. And that to a large extent is because of newer models coming in. So many years ago, we had the asset light model. Many companies did not have any large assets, but all they had was maybe some brains and an app. And they converted that into huge businesses, huge volumes, and huge customer base. And so whether it is in the mobility space or whether it is in real estate, things have been extremely different and dynamic. And this had an effect on steady businesses. The brick and mortar businesses of yesterday, they had a huge problem in managing their businesses because this asset-light businesses came in and actually disrupted their business. And I think the fourth item about technological advancements is very, very significant now because in the current aspect, you find that this is known as the Industrial Revolution 4.0. So you have not just innovation in product and processes, but there are phenomenally so many things such as the artificial intelligence, blockchain, robotic process automation, Internet of Things, augmented reality, virtual reality, and many others. And then all this, you're also using cloud computing. Today, a large number of ERPs are actually on the cloud. And anytime these new innovations come in or new technologies come in, there is always that risk. But at the same time, you cannot avoid it because now this is part and parcel of business. You may have a new person coming in today and trying to disrupt an old business. It's quite possible, and it is going to happen. And we have seen this in India as well in terms of the telecom sector, how things have changed in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of the new player coming in and taking over the market share. And this is somewhat unbelievable. And so to that extent, some of these businesses have shorter time for them to even recover in case something goes wrong. But at the same time that there is so much of value that one can bring into this business. And one of the things that are happening in the larger, the IT sector is actually collaboration. A lot of competitors are collaborating to come up with something different. This is unheard of, say, 20 years ago. Likewise, regulatory is also, there are fast-paced changes. So in my entire career, I've been to more than 25 countries. In every country that I visit, I do find that regulation is changing. There are stricter regulations coming in. At the same time, there are the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, the Denmarks, the Norway, where it is more self-regulated. There is less regulation, but more of voluntary conformance. So that's a very different kind of situation. Whereas we all know in India that there is a lot of regulation, and likewise in many other countries. And I think this is here to stay. And often in India, of course, you have regulation comes in a hard way when something really goes wrong. So I think that's where we need to ensure that we don't do that. But if at all we need to regulate, we need to regulate very clearly, and then the implementation is also to be accurate. An important aspect in the current scenario is also people uprising. I see this as an important aspect because society has also changed over time. The last 40, 50 years, society has changed. And there is this constant thinking of what society wants. What are their needs? What are their expectations? Not just from business, but also from government. And I think to that extent, when you look at things happening around you, you would be surprised how 4 million people can get into the middle of Hong Kong to protest. It is unthinkable. And we have many protests in our own country, most recently with the farmers. So these things are all coming up. It is having an impact on society, on business. Of course, not to speak of something that is directly happening in terms of the pandemic, but the fact is that pandemic actually, I must say that it's a known risk that that something may happen because of disease or because of some issues. But the fact is, nobody predicted that it would be so widespread and it would actually affect every country in the world. And so to that extent, while the likelihood of that risk was known, but everybody thought it was very low risk. Unfortunately, when it happens, the consequence of that is very, very different. So people uprising and societal expectations is also an important aspect to say what are the surrounding people. So every factory, so we have the, I think the Sterlite factory in Tuticorin that got stopped, it got shut down, and it's very unlikely that it will ever get opened again, in spite of the fact that maybe they have other things in place. But because of the shooting and something that happened some couple of years ago, it is going to be very difficult for them to open. So it is, although it is increasingly difficult for businesses to predict such responses, but I think this is having an impact on the society at large, and therefore it affects the business. Governance changes has also happened phenomenally in most places, likewise in regulatory. So you have had frameworks, you have principles, you have got the other changes to law because of governance changes, whether it is composition of the board, of the audit committee. And so in many places, a 2.0 or a 3.0 versions have also come. So to that extent, it makes it all the more ominous for all of us to. And finally, you have cyber security and frauds, and these are going to remain as it is. And my classic example of cyber security is if the Pentagon can be hacked, I don't think there's any institution in this world that cannot be hacked. At the same time, I think we have to put some minimal systems, basic systems in place to ensure that we are protected to some extent against any cyber attacks or even larger frauds. So this, I thought, is the world that we live in today. And so to that extent, we must understand that it's highly dynamic. It is not just the business, but the entire environment is dynamic. Nobody can predict what's going to happen. And if anybody tells you what is going to happen in the next 5 years, they're all just conjecture. And nobody can say that with certainty that something is really going to happen or not going to happen. So now let me come to the first part of the presentation on internal audit. Now, I thought, let me begin this session around the legal recognition of internal audit in India. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on India in terms of regulation, and then a couple of practices globally. And so that is going to give you a perspective of when you get some work around internal audit, what is it that you need to look for? So the legal recognition of internal audit actually happened in 1975, just before I started my articleship, the existing CARO was earlier MAUCARO, Manufacturing Other Companies Auditors Report, where the statutory auditor had to comment whether for certain companies the internal audit system was commensurate with the size and nature of its business. So, but this internal audit system was not what it is today. So it was more finance related, compliance related, and it was more of a support to the statutory auditor, and that's what it was seen as. And interestingly, from 1975, the entire thing continued till date. And I recall that when you look at 2004, the CARO got changed, and then again in probably sometime later, then again CARO 2016, and then we have now CARO 2020. Now CARO 2016, this was remote, but CARO 2020, there is an additional dimension which has come, which talks about the report, consideration of reports by the internal auditor. But the interesting part is when CARO did not change that much, in 2000, SEBI introduced clause 49. So I was very fortunate when I joined the Aditya Birla Group in 2001. This was a requirement under the Companies Act. For the first time, it was agreed by SEBI to set up an independent audit committee and also recognize internal audit as a key player in organizational governance. So SEBI introduced then clause 49, which came in, and that was coming out of the Kumar Mangalam committee report, where Mr. Birla chaired it, and I was in fact very privileged to work under him for so many years thereafter, almost 16 years in ABG. So this was I think a watershed legislation at that time as far as SEBI was concerned. For the first time in the year 2000, they came up with the audit committee, and to them, I think at that time, ensuring the audit committee and the board composition was much more important rather than giving any guidance on internal audit. But the good thing was they gave a good recognition to internal audit, and we will see one or two aspects how this has progressed over time. So right now, as you all know, that LODR regulations have replaced clause 49, and all these various clauses have been incorporated in LODR. 2013 again was an important year where the mandatory appointment of the internal auditor came about in section 138, and we'll go through some of these things very quickly. But it's important that it is not just for public companies, but also for private companies, and which is something which is unexpected, but interestingly, it has been done for private companies based on certain thresholds. I have looked at a couple of legislations around the sectoral regulators, I think particularly for banks and insurance. So if you're doing a bank audit, or if you're doing an insurance audit company, then we need to have complete understanding of what RBI has stated and of what IRDA has stated. And it is interesting to note that while RBI mandates banks to set up risk-based internal audit function, they did this as far back as 2002. So you had SEBI introducing something in 2000. The RBI came out with a document which says risk-based internal audit in banks in 2002. And then thereafter, they did not give any document on the internal audit function separately, but they gave something early this month on 7th of January 2021, and they gave supplementary guidance on the internal audit function, where one of the things they have talked about is actually adopting the international IIA global standards, which is an interesting aspect. They have also talked about reporting, who will the internal auditor report to, and whether the person, if he is not a board member, to who will that be. So they are quite extant guidelines so that maybe some of the doubts that are there have been cleared. Likewise, IRDA also has come up to a lesser extent, but they have a document, a comprehensive governance document issued in 2016. And that is the base as far as insurance is concerned. So let me quickly share with you on at least on the Companies Act and SEBI. Very quickly, we will go through that. So you get a perspective of what these two legislators have actually to say. and some of it you may be already aware. So I'm going to just touch upon it. But as I mentioned earlier, something that RBI has done and IRDA has done is also important, and those are really applicable if you're doing an audit in the bank or in the insurance sector. So the requirement under the Companies Act is, it says that class of companies as may be prescribed. So we will look at a small chart, and it also says that the appointment of an internal auditor has to be made, and who shall be either a chartered accountant or a cost accountant or such other professional as may be decided by the board. So it has now left to this matter to the board. In case you don't want to appoint a chartered accountant or a cost accountant, looking at the profile or the nature of the business, let's say if the company is an information security company or a privacy company, then maybe you want to have some other professional who has not just the domain knowledge, but also the internal audit knowledge. And so it may be left to the board to decide. The second aspect is that who can be there. So it can either be an individual or a partnership firm or a body corporate. So earlier when this was introduced in 2014, this was not there. And so that led to a little bit of confusion. And subsequently, I think in 2016 or 18, they made this change. And they inserted this to say that, I think it was in 2017, where they said that it could either be an individual or a partnership firm or a body corporate. And then this internal auditor may be an employee or may not be an employee. So in my tenure, I was the internal auditor for certain group companies, but I was not an employee of that company, but I was in the group holding company. So to that extent, we complied with this, but at the same time, so it was not really a requirement to be an employee of that company. And the fourth aspect from the rules, it says, is that the audit committee, in consultation with the internal auditor, formulate the scope, functioning, periodicity. So in my view, this is indirectly a form of reporting to the audit committee. Although it is not explicit, it is implicit in this, to say the audit committee will actually look at the scope, the plan, the scope of work, functioning. You will determine what kind of report. So that has to be done in consultation with the internal auditor. An important aspect here to say is that management is not in the picture. Although from a procedure point of view, it is important for the internal auditor to work with management, get the concurrence of what he's thinking of, but he must have an independent mind, then thereafter take it to the audit committee and have it approved. So that is the expectation behind this. So we spoke about class of companies. So I've tried to put it in a small chart to say, which are those public companies and private companies. So obviously every listed company, every other company, but primarily the threshold is based on, as you can see, turnover, outstanding deposits, outstanding loans, and paid up share capital. And this is, except for the turnover, which is at the end of the year, the rest of the stuff could be at any point during the year. So at any point during the year, if your outstanding deposits goes beyond 25 crores, then you're liable for having an internal audit from the next year onwards. But in the case of a private company, which is interesting because the turnover is 200 crores, which is the same, but also an outstanding loans or borrowings of 100 crores. So the numbers are the same for both for the public company and the private company, but there are only two criteria for this. An interesting aspect could be that the rules talk about audit committee, but what happens in the case of private companies? So in the case of private companies, there is no audit committee. There is no requirement under section 177. So the consensus is that the internal auditor will actually be appointed by the board and report to the board. It is quite possible that the board may nominate a member of the board to actually have oversight over internal audit. And that's my view on that. Now, when you come to SEBI, as I mentioned earlier, SEBI has had many changes to its clause 49, and even LODR had made lots of changes. Even after 2015, there were a couple of amendments in 2017 and 19. But this particular clause did not have much change. So it says that the key audit committee at its discretion shall invite the finance director or the head of finance function or the head of internal audit and a representative of the statutory auditor or any such executives to be present at the meeting. So when they say head of internal audit, to a large extent, SEBI believes that somebody in-house should do this. This is the belief, but they have not specifically said so. And they did not say internal auditor also. They just said head of internal audit. So which means that they expect that internal audit is a department or a function in the organization, and the head of internal audit is actually present in the audit committee and makes presentations about the internal audit work. There is another one which says that they can occasionally meet without the presence of any executives as well. So which is also a very good thing from a governance perspective. And likewise, there are many aspects of SEBI regulations which you will not know, where it talks about internal audit function, adequacy. And one interesting aspect is also talking about performance of statutory and internal auditors. So this is an important aspect when we are looking at performance of the statutory and internal auditors, to say how well have they performed, how well have the internal auditors performed. So I think to a large extent, we need to know whether the internal auditors have been effective, whether the work have been appreciated, and how does the audit committee get to know. So they get to know by the presentations that we make and the type of issues that you bring to the table, and how we are able to delicately balance the expectations of management and the expectations of the audit committee. So one aspect of the SEBI is about the mandatory review. So this is an interesting one to say that internal audit reports relating to internal control weakness have to be mandatorily put before the audit committee. So this is a mandatory requirement. And second, it also says that the chief internal auditor, actually, if the person has to be changed or removed, then it has to go through the audit committee. So this is again mandatory. So no company can actually remove the chief internal auditor, at least as far as the listed company is concerned. Whoever it may be, it could be an external firm or it could be an internal firm, internal person, but the removal or terms have to be approved and reviewed by the audit committee. And finally, the appointment is done by the board. So I think the board also has to be kept apprised. I thought it may be a good idea to look at, because many times in my career, I've always found that even directors have this doubt on what is internal audit and what is external audit, and what are the differences. So many of you may know this, but I thought it may be interesting to just find out and tell you that these are the 4 areas where there are differences. So first, it's in the form. So internal audit actually, as the name suggests, is internal to the organization. And the fact that today there is legislation around it is primarily because they are giving it a higher status, a higher stature, and they want to ensure that it becomes a critical player in governance. Whereas external audit is performed under statute by a qualified CA or a firm, and therefore this is the first difference in terms of form. In terms of appointment, the shareholders appoint external auditors, the board appoints the internal auditor. In terms of scope, I think because the external auditor, it's an attestation role, so it's only providing an opinion on the financial statements. Here, in internal audit, the scope is much, much larger. In fact, my belief has always been that you can consider any process, any function, any unit, any activity in the organization, and that can be reviewed by us. And to that extent, the scope, to a large extent, I would say, is unlimited, but it should be unrestricted also. It is unrestricted for the internal audit because we are looking at the health of the organization. And so the objective is for the internal auditors to provide independent assurance and advice, whereas an external audit is primarily related to the books, and then whether it shows a true and fair view of the financial statements. And that the important aspect is there are no material misstatements. So as I mentioned earlier, that the internal audit of today is actually a critical player in governance. So you have on the one side, when you look at pillars of governance in any organization, whatever it may be, it could be for profit or not for profit, You have a board of directors. In a not-for-profit, you have a board of governors, or you have a council. And then you have executive management, senior management. And then you have both these auditors, the internal auditor and the external auditor. So these four people actually have to work together seamlessly. At the same time, you have to be independent and ensure that the other parties are actually playing their job properly. And that's very, very important. The internal auditor has to ensure that the executive management and the board of directors are capable of doing what they're supposed to do, and they actually physically do it. And so to that extent, it is important that they work closely with the executive management and the external auditor to some extent, and work with the audit committee. And so if there are some issues, there are many times where I have been asked to say, how can we improve the effectiveness of the audit committee? How can we improve the effectiveness of a subcommittee? So I think this is a very good interaction that one can have to say, after all, at some point in time, if all the governance pillars work in a very seamless fashion, if they work as a well-oiled machine, then I think we will have met our objectives of giving a very transparent and open organization. So let me come to the fundamental definition of internal auditing. So the IIA, the Institute of Internal Auditors in the US, where I've been associated now for almost now 20, more than many years now, more than 25 years. It says it's an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity that adds value to and improves an organization's operations. It accomplishes its objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. Now, this is a 1999 definition, and it's almost now 20 years. The definition has not changed because the IA tried very hard to make it smaller, simpler, with a one sentence. But we believe that we did not really accomplish too much because we are really not changing too much in the definition. And also, any change that you make here changes many of the documents across the world in different jurisdictions, in different government organizations. They would have to change it. So unless there is a change that is really drastic or necessary, we felt it's good to go as it is. But maybe the future will probably go in a different direction. We may change something at some point in time. However, over the last several years, instead of the word consulting, we use the word advisory. And I think to that extent, that's the only change that we do in the normal discussion and description of certain things in terms of our activities. But otherwise, the definition is the same. It has not changed for almost more than 20 years. So if we had to ask ourselves, what is it that internal auditor does? What does internal auditing does? So my reply to that is that we have to give independent assurance. So you can always give assurance. There are a lot of people giving assurance within the organization. Maybe some corporate functions, some risk management function also is providing some kind of assurance. But we have to provide independent assurance. And I think that's our role. And what are we saying there? So we are saying that risks are managed adequately, that internal controls are working as intended, compliance processes are effective, and governance mechanisms are robust. And I think in this, there is always a level of degree of difficulty in doing certain things. Compliance processes, the easiest to do, the most objective. Internal controls can also be seen easily and reported. Risks get a little bit more tougher, difficult to, because you cannot question every risk that the organization takes. But yes, you can find out whether the process is effective or not. But the most difficult is to look at governance, what improvements are required, what one change would really make a change in the organization. And today, when you look at the world around us, a lot of failures are on governance failures, systemic failures. It is not a transactional failure, it's a governance failure. We have not put in the right governance mechanism. And there are many companies here today in India which have very good governance processes. They have disclosure processes, more than what is required by the government. And I think that's where one of the businesses will have a key differential. I recall Narayan Murthy saying once, many years ago, saying that whenever you have doubt, you please comply. Don't go into interpretation. I think that's what sums up their philosophy, the ethical conduct of that business. And so, question often asked is, if I don't have internal audit, how does it matter? Well, it depends on the size of the organization. If you're large enough, I think it's good to have a pair of eyes looking at your organization quite independently and dispassionately. And I think, what does the internal audit do? The internal auditor actually assists the board and senior management in discharging their onerous responsibilities. In many meetings, the chairman of the audit committee would turn to me and say, Mr. Shankar, do you think this is fine? Is it okay? So that the very fact, if I say, well, it looks okay to me, it's fine, we have looked at it, it gives a certain assurance to the board member. Second is to looking at risk, because if there is no risk, I don't think there's any control and there is no need to have internal audit as well. But I think because every business will have some risk, there is no business without risk. Definitely it is important for the business to identify and assess the risk. And to that extent, I think the internal auditor can facilitate that and use that in his own audit planning process. And then one of the assurances that internal auditors give is how well risks are being managed. Normally, in many companies, this is done on an annual basis when you look at the entire risk management system. But when you look at individual risks, those are done in every audit report, because every audit report, when you have a finding, is actually relating to risk. The third aspect is the focus of the audit should always be on risks that matter. And so he is in a position to look at what is most important for the organization. Every organization is different. You have small, medium, large organizations in different kind of profiles, customer profile, product profile. So it is for the auditor to find out where is that risk, the high risk that is lying there. Sometimes, as I see, a lot of risk, the financial risk lies in contingent liability. I know of a company which is 2,000 crores turnover, but the contingent liability is 10,000 crores. And I think these are the things that internal auditors necessarily have to look to get a deeper insight into that organization. Internal auditors also provide independent assurance by looking at design and operating effectiveness. So this is very important. So you have internal controls. Now the Companies Act has defined internal financial controls, which is the same thing. But primarily, we are talking about the design of controls and whether they're actually effectively operating. And then it's important for internal auditors not just look only at controls, but also they have to have the larger picture. Can they give advice and insight on business, how the business is running? So there are instances where in government, they do something called performance auditing. So that is something about how well has the business done vis-a-vis the objectives. So likewise, even in the private sector, sometimes senior management is keen to know how well has a product performed, how well has this program done. So they look at internal audit to actually go a little deeper and find out how this is happening. And the insight on business can also come from culture. There was a question that was asked to me by the chairman about culture of the organization after integration between an Indian company and a foreign company got merged, and he wanted to know how well has this actually integrated. So is there integration of systems and processes? But what about integration of the mind? I think that's also equally important. So auditors also play a very positive and proactive role in the achievement of business objectives. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I always say that internal auditors are here to help organizations to succeed. This is how internal audit brings value to any organization. So the Institute of Internal Auditors has a professional practices framework. This is popularly known as IPPF, and it has got the mandatory guidance on top. And then you have a recommended guidance at the bottom half, which is in gray color. The blue color is all mandatory. So you have mandatory guidance and then you have recommended guidance. The mandatory guidance has core principles. It has got the definition that we spoke about a little earlier. And then there is standards, and then we have the code of ethics. And these are largely, as a professional, you have to follow the core principles, the definition, the standards, and the code of ethics. And the rest of the stuff, which is implementation guidance, is left to the individual concerned, because the situation may vary in different places or different projects. So the mission of internal audit is actually to enhance and protect organizational value. So if you notice, I think from what was internal auditing thought to be in 1975, at least in India, it has come a very long way in the world as well. In many places, in many jurisdictions, internal audit was largely around finance and commercial, which is not the case today. It is completely about business. It's about business risk. And so now we are looking at protecting organizational value. So to that extent, the mission is to enhance and protect organizational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice, and insight. And there are 10 core principles that the IIA has determined to be part of the framework. And these are extremely important. These principles have to be adopted by any internal auditor doing any work anywhere in the world, to say that we need to keep this in mind when we look at our own procedures, our processes, and say, do we demonstrate integrity? Do I have competence and due professional care? Am I independent? We talked about independent assurance. So the third principle says, I'm not just objective and free, but I have to be free from undue influence. So can anybody influence me? So I think it's very, very important that I'm independent, and that independent assurance will be the differentiator as far as the internal audit role is concerned, as compared with any other role within the organization, which also gives what is known as management assurance. So we also have to align with strategies, objectives, and risks of the organization. So are we rightly positioned in the organization? Can an assistant manager be the head of internal audit in a large organization? Unlikely, because then he is not appropriately positioned. Is it adequately resourced? Large organization has got 2 auditors. Is it sufficient? So we have to see, is there co-sourcing? This is very, very important. These questions, I think the audit committee will ask. Is insightful, proactive, and future focused? Communicates effectively? One of the things that internal auditors need to really do well is to see how well they can communicate. How can you communicate better and communicate to different groups of people? I think that's most important for the internal auditor. You have to talk to somebody in the shop floor. You have to communicate to the plant management. You have to communicate with the regional management. You have to also to communicate to the managing director of the company. At the same time, you have to have a communication with the senior most, the top level body, which is the audit committee or the board. And so the communication in all these places is going to be very different. The objectives are different. The way we communicate is different. The time available is also going to be different. There are many times when I've been told by senior management, well, can you tell me what the issue is? Can you do it in 5 minutes? So I have to give the entire story in 5 minutes. So effective communication, I think, is very, very important for anybody, for whether in-house or co-sourced or fully resourced external firm doing the internal audit, doesn't matter, but I think communication has to be really good. Providing risk-based assurance, that's what we do. Internal audit is all about risk-based assurance and quality and continuous improvement. And then we are also looking at organizational improvement. So these are 10 core principles under which the internal audit is put in the IPPF. Very briefly, when you look at standards, it talks about there are basically 7 performance standards and 4 attributes. And some of the things that we spoke about, independence, objectivity, proficiency, quality assurance, they're all coming in the attribute standards. And now actually the 1000 standard, which is purpose, authority, and responsibility, basically talks about the internal audit charter. The internal audit charter is a starting point for any internal audit function to basically understand what is the purpose of this internal audit function. What is the core purpose? Why is it set up? What is it supposed to do? What responsibility does it have, and what authority does it have? And this is something that has to be laid down in writing and approved by the management or the audit committee. And therefore, in terms of a practicing accountant who does this, I think the letter of engagement has to really be giving all the details, not just the scope of work, but a little bit more than that, to say whom will the person report to and how often will the reporting be to the audit committee. And so to that extent, some of these things have to be properly written so that there is clarity, and also it would help the person in time when there is some problem. At least they can say this is what has been agreed with management and approved by the audit committee, because the letter of engagement should also be approved. If a accountant in practice is actually appointed as an internal auditor, then the letter of engagement actually should be approved by the audit committee. And that's very, very important. So actually, the board will appoint him, but the audit committee should review it. Then the board should make the appointment, and they should be fully aware of what are the contents of the letter of engagement. It should not just say only the scope of work. It should say something more than that, which otherwise would actually come in the internal audit charter of any in-house organization. Likewise, we have 7 performance standards. You have managing the internal audit activity, what is the nature of work, engagement planning, performing the engagement, communicating results. So it comes in a certain sequence. Monitoring progress is very important. How do you monitor? It's a follow-up reports that we talk about. And 2600 talks about communicating the acceptance of risk. This is very important. Suppose a risk has not been resolved for a long time, it is important for the internal auditor to convey to the management and to the audit committee to say that this is still open. ICAI also has given internal audit standards, and so many of you may be aware these are recommendatory in nature. They are not mandatory as yet, but they have largely drawn from global references, and you will find that there's a preface and a framework and basic principles. Some of the things that I spoke is also contained there in a different form. And then you have many standards that have been issued as of date. And there are many more. I think there are 8 others which have not been revised. And that probably is in the process of being revised. So these are currently what is available from a standards perspective anywhere in the world. So I don't think any other accounting body has internal audit standards, but ICAI has one, and then the other one is the global IPPF. Now let us come to stakeholder expectations. What is it that we are looking at by stakeholders? So what do we mean by stakeholders? So I have divided stakeholders in 3 parts. So one, I believe, is a very important stakeholder for us is the audit committee and the board. The board appoints the internal auditor. The audit committee ensures that we work properly, and they have complete oversight on the internal audit function, and they ensure that we give value to both the audit committee and to the company at large. But the first thing that the audit committee or the board wants is independence. They really want you to be independent. And this is a question that they would often ask me, and I used to give an annual report about our independence, that nobody had any undue influence over us in any of the stages of the audit, whether during the planning stage or during the execution stage or during the communication stage. Anybody had any undue influence over us? And that is something that we were well known for, that nobody can actually take us for granted or influence our thinking. So that is something that they could never do that. Second is a reporting relationship. So this is also important. Of course, if you're an outsourced person, then you need to ensure that you will have a reporting relationship to the audit committee. But other than that, whom do you report to? I think often what happens is we end up reporting to the chief financial officer, which is actually not a good thing. So I have never, as an in-house function, I have never reported to the chief financial officer. I always reported at a group level to the chairman of the group, and then to the individual company level, only to the audit committee, nobody else. But in an organization, it becomes difficult. I think it's good for an individual to report to the managing director. So likewise, for an outsourced firm, which does internal audit, it is good to have an engagement with the managing director off and on. Even if you are working through the chief financial officer, it is good to have a discussion with the managing director once in a while, along with the chief financial officer. That's very, very important. So objective and so they want objective and very relevant assurance. Don't tell me stories that really don't matter as of today. Give me something which is very recent. If you do the work at a certain time, I think it is important for you to communicate as well as quickly as possible, and not wait for 2 years to complete the report. Those are something unacceptable by the audit committee. And because they have so many onerous responsibilities, they would like to get some kind of comfort from the internal auditors. And they really want to know at times. So one of the things that we do is to have an executive meeting with the audit committee. So you should also try that, whether you can have a meeting separately with the audit committee to discuss certain matters. And sometimes it may be very sensitive in nature, but many large and well-managed companies actually allow that to happen. And as I mentioned here, there are good practices. Internal auditors attend the entire meeting. I've seen many firms are not able to attend the whole meeting. So in my knowledge, we always ensured that even if there are co-sourcing partners who are actually helping the group internal audit, they would also attend the meeting in its entirety. But I've also seen or heard instances where the audit committee listens to just the internal auditor presentation for 10 or 15 minutes, and then they leave the meeting. So this is not a good thing. It is a good idea. If you're appointed as the internal auditor, I think you should be in a position to attend the entire audit committee meeting, unless there are certain agenda items which are sensitive in nature. In my experience, very often the audit committee chair has a one-to-one meeting with the chief audit executive, the head of audit, a few days before the meeting. This is also a very good practice, and so that nothing comes as a surprise to them at that time. And then, as I said earlier, the audit committee also meets the chief audit executive in a private session. Nobody else is present there. This is a very good practice that is done internationally. The executive management will have a little bit of a difference in the expectations, because they say, well, we have to manage the business on a day-to-day basis. So you should be the eyes and ears, a sounding board. If something goes wrong, comes and tell us. But of course, don't look at all the risks. Please look at risks that matter. And I think that is very correct. And they want you to really look at what kind of mitigation strategies are required to manage risk. We don't want too many surprises. KV Kamath of ICAI once said that I want a good night's sleep. I want internal auditors to really do their job to ensure that the organization is going at the right line, right level, right speed. And if there are any changes that need to be made, that has to be disclosed. They should come out with it. And I think important for executive management also to allow the internal auditors to have a free discussion with them. Not that you have to really take 2 months notice for a meeting and things like that. So that should not work anywhere. It is important if you have some insight, or you want to highlight an important issue, you must be heard immediately. I think that should be the culture of the organization. Ultimately, they say that please be a business partner and a trusted advisor for me. An interesting stakeholder for us in these days is also the regulator. So although we don't report to that, I think in banks, banks have to really report in that sense at times to the regulator in certain matters. But when something goes wrong, this is always the question that is asked: where were the auditors? So we have to be a little careful on that to say that have we done our job well? Have we looked at everything? Do we know exactly what are the compliances in the organization? What kind of governance structure they're supposed to build? What are the different circulars? If you're doing actually of a bank, you should be completely understanding all the different circulars the Reserve Bank has, not necessarily only around internal audit, which may be just one or two. I mentioned to you, there's only one circular of 2002 on internal audit, risk-based audit in banks, and the second one has come in January, on January 7th, 2021. But there are so many circulars in between, which is on risk management, which is on compliance, which is on anti-money laundering. There are so many circulars that have come. So we need to understand what are the different expectations, what are the different circulars that the regulator has issued, that the bank has to comply with. And so to that extent, as long as our understanding is good and we have a robust process internally in the internal audit function, and I think nobody can question us. So at the end of it, I believe when we look at expectations, we must be a change agent. We must influence management thinking. But the important aspect is we must balance stakeholders' expectations in the best interest of the organization. That's most important. We will now come to the internal audit process. Now that we have had a quick round of what internal audit is, what is the legal structure, and what is the standards and practices, let's look at and expectations. Let's look at process. And process, I have put this a very simple graph to say there are only 3 stages in the process. The first is audit planning, short term or long term. So I know for certain that everybody has a 1-year plan. The planning that internal auditors do is 1-year plan, maybe look at it maybe 6 months at a time to see whether any changes are required. But there are many organizations who have a 3-year plan as well. So that is a good idea to look at a 3-year audit planning process. Just like companies do a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan, even the internal auditors can look at a longer term plan if you have a longer tenure with the organization. But there are many organizations, because of the nature of the industry, or let's say if you're highly tech oriented, they do a much shorter term plan. For example, every 3 months they have a plan because the change is so dynamic. The second stage is actually execution. And when you look at execution, you have an engagement planning, field work, and then you have to communicate audit results. That's all. And third, of course, is follow-up. Now, how do you know that what are the issues that have been raised in the past, that has been agreed by management, has actually been implemented? I think that's very important. One of the aspects of effectiveness of internal audit is have all the points that have been raised by us implemented by management in a timely fashion. If it is not done, then what is the point of raising those issues in the first place? I think that's the question anybody would ask. So these are basically 3 stages in the process. The scope of work, this is very important. I wanted to share this with you to say, I tried to put this in one slide to say, what kind of work can we do? And it is as approved by the audit committee. The board will approve it in the case of private limited company because there is no audit committee. Now, what is assurance? Now, assurance you have on business process or operations, you have compliance, you have IT, you have business performance. I mentioned earlier, you can give an assurance on enterprise risk management. You can look at governance activities. So I have done some work on assurance on governance in organizations, how structures can be changed, what policies can be changed. But these are a little bit subjective. I think the most objective in this would definitely be compliance, because compliance audit is the most objective of all. The second, of course, is advisory. Now, advisory could be inputs, facilitation, training. These are all advisory. And I think it is also important. But at the end of the day, between assurance and advisory, we have to see what is the composition. If you do, say, 70% advisory, then you're not an internal auditor. In my view, you must have at least 70% of assurance, or 80% of assurance. In my own example, I would say we were doing 95% assurance and maybe only 5% advisory in terms of hours spent on certain aspects. We have done a lot of facilitation on ERM in different companies. We have given inputs on development of policy or change in policy. We have given training. I have provided training on ERM to many employees, but it does not have too much of weightage in the overall work that we do. So I think the assurance has to be 90%, 95% as compared to having more in advisory. Sometimes advisory leads to good assurance as well. That is possible. Initially, you start with advisory because in advisory, you're having a one-to-one relationship. There is no user there. You're really giving something to the management and management accepts it. Whereas in assurance, it's a 3-party. So So you have the user, you have the auditor, then you have basically the person to whom you report to. So that's very, very important as well, or the process where you do it. So you have the process where you do the work, you're the auditor, and then you have a user to whom the person who will ultimately use the report. It could be the audit committee or the business. And in certain organizations, I also find that fraud investigations also is done by internal audit, like we used to do, including any violations of code of conduct or code of ethics or whatever it may be. But in some other organizations, typically like a public sector undertaking, you have a separate vigilance department, which does the vigilance, and the internal auditors actually don't go into investigation. So I mentioned earlier about the internal audit charter. I think that's very, very important. So when the scope of work is approved and you get a letter of engagement, I think some of the key terms should be specified. Let us now come to quickly to resourcing. And in resourcing, there are basically 3 ways. But before that, let me share with you that when we look at large internal audit departments, it is actually multidisciplined. You have CAs, CMAs, management graduates, engineers, IT auditors, security, data analytics, forensic auditors, and project management experts. And I know that there are 1 or 2 companies in India which is having data scientists, because data analytics is such an important area today that they have data scientists specifically in internal audit departments. So I think the resources are getting multidisciplined, multi-skilled, is becoming larger, and at times numbers are not the most important thing. It is more about what kind of competency does the individual have and the team has. And so to that extent, this could be replicated for a firm as well. So even if you're a firm of chartered accountants, do you have multidisciplined in the team? So we need to get for doing an assignment, you need people with different skill sets. So you may need engineers as well. So definitely, if you're looking at project management or some project areas, you will need engineers. In some cases, you may need civil engineers. So I think it is very, very important that we are rightly skilled, because unless you are rightly skilled and resourced, you will not be able to give value in terms of output. The resourcing methods are largely, either it's fully in-house or in-house function with co-sourcing, or fully outsourced. So if you are fully outsourced and you're the internal auditor, you'll have to do everything that is done here as though it is for an in-house function in terms of building the team. So some of it we'll come up with later in terms of how do you build effectiveness of the internal audit function. But primarily, these are the 3 methods. But there is a provision which says that in case a company is fully outsourced, but it is important that internal audit activity should be with a member of the executive management, such as the chief audit executive. So even if you are fully outsourced in a company, there must be somebody designated as a chief audit executive or a head of internal audit in the company who will actually supervise your work rather than the chief financial officer. I know that in many cases, I find the chief financial officer is the one who does the review, but there is always the thinking that whether the person will be impartial, whether there will be any conflict there or not. It's very, very important. This is a question that we have to ask time and again in the beginning itself before something goes wrong at a later date. And very important for the audit committee also to know to whom does the firm actually report to on a day-to-day basis and work with. Now we come to an important aspect of tools and techniques. So now my intention is to say what is it comprises of in about 2 or 3 slides, to say what are the tools and techniques. Now each of them could take a long time to actually decipher and explain as a training process, but it is important for a person who's coming first into internal audit to know what are the tools and techniques in internal audit. The first is risk assessment. Now, risk assessment should not be confused with the risk assessment that the organization does in terms of business risk. This risk assessment is to understand what are the risks in the organization and what will drive me to develop the audit plan and how do I prioritize work for the audit. So it's very important that internal audit resources are limited. We don't have 200 people all the time. We have a very small team. So how do I ensure that we get maximum for the dollar spent on us? I think that's very, very important. And this discussion, I'm sure you have with management all the time to say which are the areas to look at. So some risk assessment will be done by the internal auditor to determine the plan. And then ultimately the business will agree to what is required by them, which is the prioritization. Second, of course, is in all our audit reports, it's good to give process narratives and flowcharts. This is a very good technique because this establishes a common understanding between auditors and management, and everybody understands this well, and so they know where the loopholes are or where the internal control weaknesses are. It makes things easier for everyone. Sampling, of course, is an important aspect. It basically says you're scanning a part in order to provide a view on the whole. But more than that, today sampling is taken over by data analytics, and that is a discovery, interpretation, and communication of meaningful patterns in data. And I think with numbers, transaction volumes going up in many of the businesses, whether it is financial sector, it could be insurance, it could be telecom. I think analytics plays a very big role. One of the primary drivers of internal audit agenda is actually analytics, because through analytics you get to know a lot many things which otherwise you would not know. And the best part of analytics is that you're able to look at the entire data rather than a small population of the data which is representative in nature. I think that's very, very important. And so data analytics, there are many tools that are available in the market, but it's also good to use Excel and maybe MS Access in a simple way. A lot of people I know in many companies use scripts in data analytics software like ACL or IDEA, and you can run it in the system. And today, most of these analytic tools are compatible with your ERP system, whether it is SAP or Oracle. And this is a very good thing to do because you may not probably look at entire population without doing analytical tool. It's going to be very, very difficult, and it's going to be time consuming. So if you need something very quickly, I think the best way is to get a good analytics person in the team as part of the data analytics. And a lot of big people, big firms are doing this, and to see how well we can interpret data and discover and then communicate the patterns, because that's very, very important. Interview techniques is again a very solid area for training. It's not very easy to get information out of the management, but then you need to ensure that we have the right kind of questions, and we are in a very professional atmosphere environment when we do that, and so that makes it a little easy for both of us. We need to explain purpose, so there is actually a preset guidelines of how do you conduct an interview, and I think that's very, very important, and this requires a lot of focus and training at the firm itself for different levels in the organization. And then of course audit evidence is very, very important. You should be in a position to draw reasonable conclusions, but I think the more important thing I always believe is that even when you look at the coal scam, the CBI judge said, I've been waiting for 2 years, but I don't have any evidence. So both of them were let off free. I think evidence is crucial when we look at even a simple audit, forget investigations, but even simple audit, we need evidence to say that this is not right, or this is going too bad, or this is ineffective. And without that statement of evidence, it is difficult for management to agree to it. And I think very important first for management to understand that there is a problem, and that they will only understand if they believe that the evidence actually relates to that problem. And finally, I would look at some of the emerging technologies that I spoke right in the beginning about artificial intelligence, or it's cloud computing, or it is bots, or it's robotic process automation. I think the internal auditor must have some understanding of this, because there are companies slowly migrating some of these things. Today, lots of processes have got bots inbuilt. I think internal auditor must understand what the risks are. What does this mean? What is the framework? What is the architecture of all these things? What does it do? automatically, what it doesn't do. The very fact that it is a machine, it can work tirelessly, it has absolutely no fatigue. That's the plus point. But it all depends on what is fed into it. So to that extent, garbage in, garbage out. So we need to understand what is what is the usage of some of these technologies in business, and really, is it really efficient and effective? That's very important for the internal auditor to understand, because today more and more businesses will use the fourth dimension technology. Important aspect is, of course, tools and techniques is the audit report writing, where most internal auditors spend 50% of their time. And I think it's important that we clearly understand what the objective is: to inform, to persuade, and to impel management action. These are the three objectives of audit report writing. And one of the globally adopted systems, which I like very much, is known as the 5 C's. And I will quickly run through that. The 5 C's talk about criteria. And basically, the first C is criteria. Criteria says what is a standard that was not met. So the standard may be a company policy or other benchmark. What is the condition? What is the problem identified? Very important. What is the cause? Which is what allowed the condition to occur in the first place. And then you have something called consequence. In other places, people say that this is impact, but I prefer the word consequence because it's a noun. Impact could also be a verb as well as a noun. So I think it is good to have the word consequence, just like I will explain later to you that we have the same thing in the risk management slides as well. So what is the implication? What is the negative outcome or opportunity lost because of the finding? I mean, if every report or every issue identifies this, then it makes things much easier. And then corrective action. What should the management do about the finding? What have they agreed to do and by when? Then the other aspect of, once we look at the tools and techniques that gives us a good report, it's very important to have audit working papers. Audit working papers and quality assessment is very, very critical. And I think as we move forward, there is a lot of pressure on firms to do a better job and to ensure that they are better than the best. And we also want to know that whether the firms have done due diligence in their work. So their work has to be probably peer reviewed by someone else, some other team within the organization. That's a good way to do it. For example, if you have a team A can do a peer review of team B's internal audit work and see how well it does. Have they followed all the procedures, the manual? And so that's a very good way of looking at it. And then, of course, quality assessment can be done in the same way. But documentation is critical, because tomorrow if we have a problem, we need to ensure that documentation is maintained. And this is one of our weak areas, even in-house. The documentation may not be there at every place at all the times. It's very, very important for a third party to come and see the documents and say that, well, this looks fine, this is good enough. And by this, when I look at it, I reach the same conclusion as before. Let me take you through the beginning of risk management, and then we will take a break at about 6:30, if that is fine. We still have about 10 minutes left. So the reason I'm looking at risk management, this is a very short, part of risk management. We can do a lot more on risk management if you want to get deeper into it, but at least we should get some idea of what risk management is. And so with that in mind, I've put in a few slides, not very elaborate, but to give you a perspective on what risk management is all about and how is it related to audit. As I mentioned earlier, we do internal audit because there is risk in business. If there is no risk in business, to a large extent, I think internal auditors may not be required. Because there is risk in business, there is control has to be in place. We need an internal control system. We need to have checks and balances. And that's the reason why we have an independent assurance provider called internal audit. So I always look at Warren Buffett when it comes to risk. He has amassed huge wealth, probably close to 200, maybe 150, 160 billion dollars. And he also takes calculated risk. I recall in one of the articles I read that he bought a company on a telephone worth about $2 billion. Now, question is his risk appetite. He did a phone call about the company, went through the balance sheet and profit and loss account, did a deep dive on the financial statements, and then finally decided to invest in that company. But the fact is that if he has invested $160, $170 $1 billion over time, he knows exactly where to invest, what to invest, what is a gut feel. But his quote on risk says that risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. I think that's a wonderful statement that he made. That it says that you actually do many things, but you actually don't know what you're doing, what you are actually getting into, what is the environment that you're in. So there are many things that you don't know. And that is why risk is all about uncertainty. And there is another person called Thomas Stewart. He was the, I think, editor of a magazine. And he says that, risk is good. The point of risk management is not to eliminate it. That would eliminate reward. I think for anything that we do, there is risk. We must take risk. But the most important thing is we need to understand where to place bets, where to hedge bets, and where to avoid betting altogether. So when we look at risk treatment, you will probably understand this a little bit better. But it is suffice to say that it is important that risk management is here to stay because there is no business without risk. And to that extent, I think we need some independent assurance person within the organization to see how risk is being managed. Let me give you quickly about a framework on risk. There are many frameworks. I think the reason I'm putting this across is I think Mr. Jain asked me in the beginning whether we should call it as enterprise risk management or we should call it as risk management. The reason I chose risk management is because right from the beginning, most of the documentation is on risk management. The Companies Act also talks about risk management in many places, and so also the SEBI. And to a large extent, enterprise risk management largely means risk management at the enterprise level. There could be variation in understanding, but basically it says when you say enterprise risk management, which I would explain to you is only used by COSO ERM. So the COSO ERM says COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework 2017. So originally we had the Institute of Risk Management in the UK, which along with two other bodies came up with a document in 2002. That was the origin in terms of a risk management framework. But there have been many documents around risk in the past, maybe the last 50, 60 years. But a framework actually in terms of detailing what a risk management framework should look like, which would look at all risk, not necessarily insurance risk, because that was the context in the past. When anybody said risk, it meant insurance. But that is not the risk that we know today. Risk management is broader in nature. It has greater content, wider in application. It can be applied to any industry, any business, anywhere in the world. And so to that extent, IRM, Institute of Risk Management in the UK, came up with something in 2002. But at the same time, COSO had something in 2004. So as and when we have some calamities, some organization falling, whether the Barings Bank or something else, somebody comes up with, these are all voluntary organizations, they came up with something. And Australia standards, New Zealand standards, 4360 also came up sometime in 1995, and they came up with a 2004 document. But the next time, 5 years down the line, 2009, that had to be refreshed. But at that time, they went to the ISO organization and they said, let's team up with ISO. And so ISO came up with a document called, for the first time, ISO 31000 2009. And then that got replaced very recently, 2 years back, in 2018, which made it a little simpler. The entire documentation was cut short, and it's a very good piece to read. It's just only about 15 pages. I guess you'll have to buy it from the website, but it is worth the read. It's very simple and, in my view, easy to implement. And there are some tutorials available as well on certain channels where you can actually learn a little bit more about it. But these are very good, and I have applied it myself recently in a consulting experience with a hotel company. So it talks about principles and guidelines, and but ISO is truly international because, as you know, the International Standards Organization is a large entity represented over 175 countries. Unlike the COSO ERM framework actually is largely US, North America based, and this document has been developed by PwC. So therefore, most accountants and others follow the COSO ERM framework. But ISO is new. It's gaining some ground. It's taking some time, and then 2018 is what is the latest document. And finally, we have the ISO IEC 27, which is largely for information security. So these are the 4 frameworks. And so what we will do is we can just break quickly for, we can have a break for about 5 minutes now. That is acceptable.
Yeah, the time is 6:27. We'll
Yes.
reassemble at 6:32, 6:33.
Yes, sir. That's fine. Thank you. That's good.
You can leave things as it is, sir. 6:30 will reassemble. Like you can just pause your camera and take a break.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Warm banana microwave.
Selva, if you can just leave a message to all the participants telling that we reassemble at 6:33, or give me the rights where I'll be able to post it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I got the rights. Thank you, sir.
நடுவுல பண்ண என்ன எடுத்தவர்கள்
I think the speaker is yet to join, Sundaran sir.
We'll wait, no problem. You're allowed now. So I'm just with you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the company. In fact, sir, I may not be available till the end. I will have to leave for another meeting. But since there was time and the third session was so interesting, I kind of stayed to the maximum time.
No problem.
Sundaran sir, as of now, there are no questions. Selva will flash the questions later once the session is over. If there are any questions,
it has been messaged already.
No, there are no
I think it
questions.
has been messaged already.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes.
any input? Is it okay?
Yeah, all fine, sir. As of now, no questions have come. So we can go ahead and then take ones which come in the later in the end, actually.
Yeah, sure, anytime. So I will try to conclude by 7:30 or
That will
even
be
earlier
great.
if possible. But so let me know if you have any inputs, anything you want me to
Shankar,
say
sir,
or something.
there is no hurry, however, because later we'll be putting this material recording for people to view later also. So this will be an
Right.
asset for people who want to take the benefit
Sure.
later on. So no hurry, sir.
Sure. Okay. So are you able to see the
I think
screen
you
or
can-
no?
Yes, sir.
The
Yes,
screen
sir.
is there, open only.
The screen is open. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Can you just
Sir, you can
move one
continue.
screen to this? Can you just move the screen to see whether it is working, sir?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
It is
it's working, sir. It's good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect, sir. It's perfect.
So should we start now or?
No, we can go ahead, sir. We can start, sir, please.
You can go ahead, sir. No problem. It is already 8:35. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back after the break. So I mentioned about the risk management frameworks just before the break. And as I mentioned earlier, everything was related to insurance in the beginning. It's only after 2002, with every calamity, I think a lot of organizations teamed up and started making a framework of how do we manage different risks in the organization. And so to that extent, COSO did some work. And then we had a very important piece of framework done by the Australia standards and the New Zealand standards. And I got exposed to it sometime in 2004. They started in 1995. And when I went there in 2004 and the board in one of the Australian companies wanted a risk management to be done of a mining company. And immediately we used the same framework, which is Australian New Zealand Standard 4360. And thereafter, as I said, in 2009, they teamed up with ISO so that you get international recognition rather than making it as a risk management standard only for Australia and New Zealand. And the good thing about Australia and New Zealand is that even in government organizations and government departments, risk management is mandatory. So that's an interesting insight which I wanted to provide to you. It will take some time in this country or anywhere else, but in many places, risk management is mandatory in the government as well. But the ISO document, as I said, it's very small, it's very concise, it reduces a lot of jargon, but at the same time, it gives the flexibility to customize the risk management process depending on the size of the organization, the scale, the product profile, the customer base, the geography spread. So that's a good thing to do. So primarily, if you look at this slide, there are basically two frameworks that people use. It's either the COSO framework or the ISO 31000. So ISO 31000 will still take some time because it has come about only in 2009. And it is still not fully popular. It is not a certification. And so to that extent, it clearly says that the intent was not to have it certified. In fact, it calls itself as risk management guidelines. But it's a nice document. I would encourage all of you to have a look at it because this is a very small document, but full of meaning, and you will get a gist of it. Because the reason why I insist on this is because internal audit has everything to do with risk. So if we understand the risk lexicon, the vocabulary, and why certain things are written the way they are written, so it gives us a better appreciation of when we look at the risk register in an organization, then we'll know whether it is written well or not. Coming to definitions, I thought it may be a good idea to look at, what are the factors. See, though it very clearly says this is taken from the risk management guidelines of ISO. So organizational objectives are influenced by internal and external factors, which create uncertainty in achieving those objectives. So it is actually uncertainty that actually gives rise to risk. Now, today, for example, there is the pandemic in the world. I think almost 170 or so, I did a count in the WHO database. 170 countries, areas, territories have been impacted by this. But the best part is that we still don't know what's going to happen next. So there is still uncertainty around many other things. So for example, will the vaccine be effective? Is there a likelihood of a variant again coming back? Because today, I understand that Bahrain is under lockdown for next week. And then there are a couple of other countries which are under lockdown. I read somewhere to say that Maharashtra is going to go on lockdown. I'm not very clear of that, but the fact that one is with the existing virus and the pandemic that we are trying to create, that we are trying to take steps to contain it. We have contained it to a larger extent, but we don't know when the second wave will come, whether the second wave has any other remedies. So to that extent, we are living in a world when we know the risk and still there is uncertainty around it. So I think the word uncertainty is key. So for example, we don't know what the stock market how it will behave in the next 3 months, 6 months. And that's why I think it is difficult to predict anything today because of too many variables around. So the ISO 31000 2018 has a definition on risk which simply states the effect of uncertainty on objectives. This is a very simplistic definition, yet in my knowledge, it's a very powerful definition. The effect of uncertainty or objectives. And so to that extent, if you remember this, it's a very good definition for us to understand what risk is all about. Secondly, in all organizations, whatever be the size, you have either a strategic risk or an operational risk. So this is my considered view after spending almost 15, 20 years in risk management and internal audit. I've come to the conclusion that the companies have strategic risk, which is very long term and more at a 3-year to 5-year horizon. And the other is operational risk, which is more 12-month horizon, day-to-day horizon. What are the key operations? So typically a compliance would be an operational risk. Compliance of laws, something on your accounting systems is operational risk. But strategic could be more long term. So for example, in telecom, what would be the telecom policy coming up? I'm talking about a few years ago. So that is more strategic in nature if we have to give a response to the telecom policy. And what should organizations do? And then every risk is either internal or external. I think this is important for us to understand that external risk is actually uncontrollable. It is outside your control. Internal risk is actually very much within our control. So an issue in SAP is very much in your control. If it is a procedural or transactional risk, but an external risk, maybe a natural calamity, is outside my control. But what is in my control is only some aspect of that. So maybe I can contain the damage, I can reduce the consequence of that risk, but I cannot do anything about the likelihood of that risk, whether it's an earthquake or rain or flood. So sometimes there is also this word called threat. So I do believe that threat is an intent to inflict evil. So threat is actually not risk. So risk is different. And we'll talk about risk a little bit more granularly in the next few slides. But threat is an intent to inflict evil, injury, or damage coupled with capability. So if somebody has nuclear weapons, they may be a threat to us, especially if there is an intent to inflict. So a great example is North Korea and South Korea. So North Korea is always seen as a threat to South Korea because they have an intent to inflict, because they are outside the world order and they have the nuclear capability. Vulnerability is capable of being physically or emotionally wounded. So I think when individuals or systems are vulnerable, that means it can be hacked. Somebody can gain access to the system because there is vulnerability. A great case is a private bank called Cosmos Bank. I don't know how many of you know this. It's in Pune. Some 2 or 3 years ago, in a matter of some 2 hours, they took out $100 million of customers' money. And that too, not by anybody within India, but outside India through the system. And what they did was they went through, they disbanded their existing server, and then they put in their own server in the cloud, in the system, and they ensured that they could withdraw money from anywhere through cards that were cloned. So 450 cards were used, cloned cards, and prior to this, they were doing some kind of phishing exercise with customer, and they were getting all the information about the card, the account number, and all that through the phishing exercise. But they did this in a matter of 2 hours, and no alert went to anybody because the server was changed. And so anytime somebody put a card in the ATM, it would go to their dummy server and it would approve, and then they would get the money out. So to that extent, what happened was that their entire system was vulnerable because they have not spent enough money in protecting basic systems from external threat. So I think that system was very vulnerable open. So when you run an antivirus, it will say there are certain vulnerabilities in certain applications. And that means that it can be, either hacked or entered into, or a malicious program can be sent easily because there is something that is open. The door is open somewhere. So this is important to understand these words. And when we talk about a risk event, the risk event has got actually a few ingredients. And these ingredients are, it's a future event. It is not something of the past. So when we look at a risk event, we are looking at the future, the uncertainty in the future, not past. Now, in my view, the pandemic is no longer a risk in the risk management system. It is only something that we are trying to mitigate. Maybe a mitigation plan will come against the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic by itself is no longer a risk, but there could be certain aspects of that which can still be a risk in terms of uncertainties. So it must have an adverse impact. See, the outcome has to have an undesirable impact. For example, a loss, it could be reputation, it could be money, and that it must have an outcome that is desirable. So then it will be a risk event. And there has to be a reasonable probability or likelihood of occurrence, some level of certainty. So you can't say something, which is unlikely to happen or improbable to happen. So, but yeah, you have to do now. What is the chance of a meteor falling on a factory plant? So I don't think we should get to that level. But yes, if a meteorite has to fall on Earth, I think it will take away not just the factory, but probably the entire city or something. The second is it should have an effect on objectives. This is very, very important. And I think this risk event is going to be there very much after the pandemic because many businesses have gone. It has affected not many businesses in the travel tourism sector. And so it's a consequence of this risk, which nobody in the travel tourism sector would have even thought about. But it has had an impact. Hotels have had an impact. People are scared. So there's a social aspect to it. Because of the pandemic, I don't want to go and meet people. I don't want to stay outside. I don't want to eat outside. So restaurants are going down. So these issues have to be relooked at, and all these businesses have to relook. Now, it also created an opportunity. When you look at the pandemic, it created an opportunity for people because when you're looking at risk, you're looking at both an adverse side and a positive side. The positive side is the opportunity. And so today, all those people who could actually make a mask, they produced masks, they sold it, they made some money. So it became a business opportunity or a PPE kit. So this has never been done before. So it also shows you risk also gives you opportunities. When you look at the risk management process, how do you manage the process? I've simplified it in 4 or 5 items. First of all, we have to identify the risk. There are many ways of doing this, but I will not go into those details. But a good way is to call people, have a brainstorming session, look at senior management and others, and identify what are the 15 risks, 20 risks, 30 risks within the organization, just by surveying people or talking to people. Then you have to assess those risks. I mean, does it really look like a risk? Is it priority or not? And then we need to prioritize that. And then we need to finally, when we look at assessment, we not only look at whether they look like risk, but we also have to evaluate it and see whether, what is the likelihood of that risk actually happening, and if it happens, what is the consequence of that. And then the important aspect is to see how do you respond to these risks. Once we say, well, these are the 10 risks in my organization, how do you treat those risks? And that treatment is very important. Treating risk is, how do you respond to those risks? Responding to risk or treating risk is the same thing. And finally, we need to monitor it. We need to communicate that risk to different stakeholders. I mean, you have to look at the audit committee. You have to look at senior management. You have to look at the MD of the company. The MD should know what the risks are. If it is a company that is, the top 500 in terms of market capitalization, they have a risk management committee that should look at it, and they have to report to the board. So there are lots of communication that takes place about risk. Very, very important. The Companies Act does not have much on risk, except it says that the risk management policy has to be laid down, I think under 134(3), and that any risk that threaten the existence of the company has to be identified. So that is a very important aspect. Any risk that threaten the existence of the organization has to be identified. So when we look at risk, it is generally viewed as a function of consequence and likelihood. So normally we say consequence or impact. As I mentioned earlier, it is negative. The word consequence is better than impact, primarily because that the consequence is a noun. Impact is both a noun and a verb. Sometimes it loses its meaning. And so what does consequence mean? So it's a negative result. It could be reputation loss, financial loss, penalties, downtime, stoppage of plant, workers going on strike. It could be anything. A fatality in the plant is also a consequence. So if you have poor systems in the plant, if you have poor safety conditions in the plant, you could have fatalities in the plant, and you will have to shut shop. 1 week, 10 days, 15 days, there'll be no production. So that's a consequence if you have a poor safety record. And in safety, I must also say that I've often discussed this a number of times, that safety is also in India a cultural issue. And I always believe that we are as good as the next incident. So once the next incident happens on safety, then we know how good or bad we have been. But safety is something that we really don't give too much attention, although there are lots of companies that have taken it in the right perspective. Second is likelihood. So likelihood also means probability of occurrence. The word likelihood is better than probability, primarily because probability is more to do with numbers and mathematics. So to that extent, it's the word likelihood is something that is used even in the ISO 31000 documentation. Nowadays, we find in certain risk maps that I have been involved in, we have also used urgency and velocity, because not all risks come at you at the same time. So there may be some delay in certain, and some are more urgent. So you can demonstrate that through a nice heat map. Risk appetite is another term that is generally used, which says what is the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept. I think this is important because risk appetite is extremely important. It is set by the board. This is one aspect of the COSO document, but the ISO does not talk about risk appetite. So they have kept quiet about it, and they want to leave it to the organization to determine what is a risk tolerance or an appetite, so that it is less confusing. On risk treatment that I mentioned earlier is, I mentioned to you that risk treatment is something that once you have identified all the risks, you have these risk statements, and then you say, well, this is the risk. So how should I treat it? So there are basically 4 methods of treatment. This is internationally accepted, and maybe the words could be different, but this is also given in another manner called 4 T's, but I use it like either you avoid it. So the first is you don't get into it at all. So you want to avoid risk, just don't get into it. So if you're looking at a business proposal and you finally say, well, I'm going to scrap this business proposal, it is too heavily risked for me. So you're actually avoiding that risk rather than getting into it. But it is possible that you get into a strategic venture. So at that time, we have evaluated risk, but we have agreed to go into it, and then we set up business. Then it becomes a different risk. At that time, we need to monitor that risk. And after some time, if you feel that it is not going to do well, then you decide to close it. So a good example from ABG itself was the idea of Payments Bank. So Payments Bank was started maybe 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So it went in full swing. Then there were some legal issues with the regulators, I think, the legal issues and things like that. Then ultimately they had to liquidate. So it is not necessary that sometimes you cannot avoid this avoidance in the first instance, but the first time you do something, you look at it as an opportunity. But the second time, when you look at it, you feel it is better not to bleed further. It's better to close it. Likewise, it has happened in a couple of businesses I've seen all around us, where something starts and then you close it up after 1 year or 2 years. But the sooner you do it, the better, so that you don't bleed any further. The second, of course, is to accept but monitor. So this is largely what comes out of the risk register, is that you accept those risks, but you need to keep monitoring it. Accept means you accept it the way they are, but you don't do anything about it. You don't do anything about it, but you just have to closely monitor it to ensure that the risk level does not increase over time. The third is, of course, you transfer it. So often we transfer risks relating to, natural calamities. So maybe you take out insurance. You have a third-party insurance for earthquake or floods, or you can have a consortium. So through consortium also you're transferring risk. But the fact is that this also is up to a limit. So that again depends on the risk appetite. So in simple terms, if you want to take an insurance for yourself on a personal level, for your house or something, so you'll have to take a call on what is the cost at which you will take, replacement cost, current cost, market value. So this is something that you transfer to the insurance company, but ultimately in the hope that your liability is not more than that in case something had to happen. The fourth one is more prevalent. Generally speaking, in most of the risk registers, you will have items that relate to either 2 or 4. The remaining 2 will largely not come there. So when you have to do a control action, so what you're trying to do is when you mitigate something, so in number 2, you're not mitigating, you're accepting the situation as it is today. And you say, well, I will monitor this, I will ensure that the risk level does not go either above or below. If it goes below, in certain cases is better, but I will not go, I will not allow it to go beyond something. Whereas the last one is control mitigate. So here what we have to do is any risk that has a control action or a mitigating control, we have to ensure that it either reduces the likelihood or the consequence or both. If it doesn't do any of this, then it is not an action. It is not a mitigating action. So that is an important aspect to check. What is the robustness of the ERM process in the company? So any internal auditor who looks at it has to see whether this is a reasonable control. Sometimes even in internal audit reports, when we give suggestions, when we give recommendations, we have a finding. The management says we will explore certain options. Exploring options actually doesn't reduce the risk. It doesn't reduce either consequence or likelihood. So the level of risk remains the same. Let's say for 2 to 3 years, they keep exploring options. That means the original risk that was identified has still remained. So it is important, if it is significant, to bring it to the knowledge of the audit committee. So sometimes for management to get out of a situation, they will give certain action plans which state we will explore this further. So next we look at, of course, you're all aware of internal control because the COSO internal control framework is something that we use everywhere. It's also recommended. And then this is the definition of internal control, which is the process, but it is designed to give only reasonable assurance and not absolute assurance. This is something that no assurance, including internal audit, also gives reasonable assurance because you're not looking at 100% of the things all the time. But there is a responsibility in the area that we do work. We have to ensure that we do a proper job and give the right kind of results so that management gets comfort from it. So internal control looks at objectives in the following categories of efficiency, effectiveness of operations, reliability of financial reporting, and compliance. And we also have the internal control framework, which is an important aspect, which is the same framework, which has got 5 components and then 17 principles. So they're all aware of it. So basically, these are the 2 operating things in the internal control framework, which is largely used by organizations today in the internal financial controls setup, which is again explained here to say what this means. And in my view, this is the most exhaustive definition of internal control. And I did some research on where this internal financial controls come from. And apparently it is taken from the King report of South Africa. But the King report of South Africa, when it defines internal controls, internal financial controls, it restricts itself to only financial reporting and not for controls for the business. Whereas if you look at the definition here, it looks at both accuracy, completeness of accounting records, timely preparation of reliable financial information, as also, if you see right in the beginning, it's orderly and efficient conduct of its business. So efficiency is also looking at in this definition, which is much wider and therefore much more difficult to implement in its totality. So I think in this also, in many of the organizations that we have rolled out, we have looked at a very considered view and said that we should not go overboard, but look at some of those key risks and key controls. So maybe 100 risks, 200 or 300 controls, not more than that, so that we try to capture 95% of what can go wrong within those. It is important for me at this stage to talk a little bit about culture. And I think culture is so critical. And I think many of the recent collapses, both internationally in India, is because of poor governance as also culture. And I think culture is often defined as the way we do things here, our practices, our beliefs, the unwritten rules. And as this chart shows, if you look at an iceberg, you have 10% of it above the water, which is what we can see. And the remaining 90% is below the water, which we don't see. So culture in an organization is, people can tell you this is the vision, this is the strategy, these are the goals, these are the policies, structures, procedures. You can see all of them in writing. But the point is, how is it practiced? And there are many unwritten rules. And this is something that I've seen all the time. What does hierarchy mean? Can a junior person go to the senior person and speak to that person openly or not? Or does he have to go through hierarchy? This is very important. So I think perceptions, norms, values, feelings, these are things we don't know. What do people feel about something else? And so for an organization to have a very phenomenal culture, good culture, I think it's very critical. So sometimes, and I think more often than not, poor culture has an effect on organizational performance. It has an effect on the way people are being treated, the respect that employees have of the senior management. And so to that extent, sometimes quick action demonstrates good culture rather than dragging their feet about something which is very, very obvious. So these are things that should never happen. And if you get these signs during an internal audit, that means there is something not good happening in the organization. So that has to be highlighted in an appropriate manner at the right kind of forum. The reason I brought this is what in some of our discussions in other places, we also do, many organizations are looking at a culture audit. Well, I have not really done that individually, but we have looked at different aspects of culture and looked at, how does it affect the performance? How does it affect controls? Why is it that a certain control that was fixed earlier is no longer fixed? It is again been, overlooked. Is it some kind of a management override of controls? So why did that happen? What did the earlier management think and feel about something? What does the new management think and feel about something? So these are things that we are always looking at to see, does the organization need some kind of a therapy so that they become better, become healthier? And is there somebody I can lean towards? Is the managing director or the group director willing to listen to me? These are things that we need to have conversations about. And culture is going to be extremely important. It has always been important, but I think now more and more it's coming to light. Before I get into effectiveness, I just thought I would share quickly on some of these global trends that we see in internal audit. So what kind of internal audit teams are there in different parts of the world? And one aspect that comes to my mind is being agile. You will get lots of literature on agile internal audit, but basically it means that you have to be smarter and faster. See, in the olden days, we used to have large audit departments, but today more and more management says, well, you have technology, you have access to more and more people, and now probably they will say that, well, you can access people through video conferencing. You don't have to physically visit and have a discussion with people. You don't have to travel that much. Can you reduce a little bit of traveling and conduct all your meetings online? So these things are possible. But I think if you're doing a plant audit, it is difficult, as I think, to do it virtually. You have to visit the plant to get a feel of it. And I always believe that doing audit by walking about the place is the most effective way of doing something rather than remotely. But some level of remote interactions can happen. I think that's going to be the future because people and management want more from less. the scope enhancements largely talk about newer areas. Normally when you look at any internal audit department, they will have a sales audit, they will have a procurement audit, they will have a logistics audit, they will have a treasury audit. So these are very common. Can we look at newer areas? Can we have something around customer? So I think there is something called a thematic audit that has also come about, and where we can connect all the dots. And this requires a lot of understanding of the business and process. And to some extent, we tried this in the telecom business as well, to have thematic audits. So we can have end-to-end, right from the time the customer takes a phone until the time he's satisfied after a month of usage. We'll have to look at different departments who go through them and see how they have performed and how is the satisfaction of the customer. I think it can be applied even to a brick and mortar business. It could be an FMCG and others, to say, is the customer happy at the end of the day? Because ultimately the business, the top line is given by customer. Tomorrow, if you don't have any customer, what happens? You won't have any business, you won't have any revenues. So the customer is the king. And I think all organizations are now customer centric and employee centric. And so we need to have the pulse on the customer as also on the employee. And so can there be some newer areas that we can look at, either in terms of risk or litigation or regulation or something like, for example, a competition act. So if you're an FMCG product, what kind of clauses do you have with companies or dealers or distribution agents? Is there any prima facie violation of what is stated in the Competition Act? So these are things that we should look at, because these are newer areas, probably not looked at before. And I mentioned about auditing culture, so that is something that large organizations, very large organizations overseas have done this, and they have it as part of their system as well, even in banks. Focus, of course, on cyber risks and their audit. Automating assurance. So I think in many in-house functions and also firms, they're using some more of IT. So for example, this robotic process automation is being applied in the internal audit process as well. So to make it more robust, more analytical, and ensuring that you spend less time on some of the routine stuff. I think this is something that is really happening. And as I mentioned earlier about industrial 4.0, I think you have the new age technologies. How well have we understood that is something that internal auditors need to keep that in mind. And of course, there is always the war for talent. How do you build new competencies for the future, and what is the future? So I think the more reading we do and we talk to other people of what they are doing, how do you see the world change in the next 2 or 3 years, and what kind of talent we need to build. So sometime back I mentioned about one large organization getting data scientists into the internal audit team. So today internal auditors are really multifunctional, multidisciplined, and maybe 10 years back we would never have imagined. So today, as they say, data is a new oil. It is information, it is power. If you have data, you are the king. So I think we have to do as much as possible around data. But the problem with data often is that it may not be structured, or every data is not structured. So you have to sometimes even look at unstructured data. How do you do that? So there are tools available. And we have to get into it. We have to put on our thinking cap and see how best we can address this issue for the benefit of the organization. So I will now come to the final part of this presentation, which is more about what constitutes effectiveness. If you recall, at least for all the listed companies, there is something in the SEBI guidelines which says that the performance of the internal auditor has to be evaluated by the audit committee. Now, how will the audit committee do that? So they would do that as and when you present your findings and share with them, and then you have a discussion with them maybe at the end of the year. The management also has a word or two about your work, whether you're effective or not, and what areas you need to improve. But if you look at effectiveness overall, I think the proof is always in the pudding. So what is the delivery that you do to the audit committee and to the management? So one part of aspect, I thought there are 4 or 5 points I've just written in a very brief area. So I said that, look, first is, this has come in the principles as well, that you have to be independent and must act with integrity. So I'm also sharing some of my articles on independence as well as along with 2 other articles, and you should be getting that along with the pack. The reason why independence is important, because I find that in many of the cases where frauds have happened or business failures have happened, perhaps both external internal auditors have not been really independent. And so here are a few points I'm making to say that when you're looking at regulator, so when the regulator says that the Companies Act says that the internal auditor will be appointed by the board, and he should be either a chartered accountant or a cost accountant or any other profession, the basic expectation is that you have to be independent, you must have integrity. Now, integrity is in any case part of a code of professional ethics, there is no doubt on that. But independent, again, is a state of mind, but at the same time, you have to demonstrate independence by not getting unduly influenced. So the question is that, you know, there is a firm of chartered accountants in one of the programs. I asked that person, are you really independent? He says, well, I'm more or less independent. There is nothing like 90% independent or 98% integrity. Either you are independent or you're not independent. Either you have integrity or you don't have integrity. And in fact, on integrity, the late former President Abdul Kalam said, if you have integrity, nothing else matters. If you don't have integrity, still nothing else matters. So the question is that integrity is most important. I would always say, even within my own team, I used to give high regard and respect and marks for integrity within my team. And I used to demonstrate integrity by leading by example. I think that's very important. And I think this is very, very important. Sometimes there is a thin line between what is integrity, what is not integrity. Can I have this kind of a conflict of interest situation? No, we cannot have. So we have to be very clear, and we should avoid some potential conflicts of interest if there are any. Likewise, we have to be independent. Sometimes there are potential impairments to independence. And I recall in my article I've written about it, one CFO called me and said that, can you change the scope of this? So we were doing a separate examination on travel expenses many years ago. So he called me and said, can you change the scope of this exercise that you're doing? So immediately my antenna came up and I said, well, this appears to be affecting my independence, because I have determined that this should be the scope, not some other period. So immediately, within 5 minutes, I called up the managing director and told him that this is what the CFO is asking me to do. And within another 5 minutes, I get a call from the CFO to say that, well, I did not mean that. Well, I closed the matter. But the important thing to learn from this is that there was a potential impairment, and I did resolve it at the same time. I did not allow it to be carried forward. I think the important aspect for all of us is, whenever there are potential impairments to independence, we must get it resolved. It's very important. I know as a practicing accountant, it may be difficult because you're also weighing the pros and cons of what will happen to the engagement or to the business. But I think it's important in the long run to ensure that we walk out of certain places where we find it hard to continue. And I think that's very, very important to do that. And you will find you will bear the fruits of this decision at a much later date. I know many firms which have either walked out of certain assignments because of some problems. Either they said, well, you should not report this or report that. So that is again your impairing independence, because the auditor should determine what to report and what not. And I think typically what may happen is management may look at what report you're doing at the end of the quarter before it goes to the audit committee. But you must have the freedom to say, unless everybody believes that it is not objective. I think that is important, or material. So we don't know what is material, what is not material. It's auditor's judgment. It can be challenged, no doubt. But let there be a guidance from audit committee to determine what is materiality in terms of reporting. I think that's important. So to that extent, I think impairments to independence must be resolved. Within the team, if you have a partner or a senior partner, the team leader must have unquestionable integrity. And there is always pressures, I'm sure about it, within the business, either at the lowest level or at the middle level or the senior level. I think we should not succumb to them. That is very important. If team members have some problem, they must have the freedom to raise these issues to the seniors, including matters relating to conflict of interest. So I think if you do these things in the right manner, it helps people to understand what is expected from the audit team. And I can guarantee that people will look up to you with high regard. That I'm certain about. The second is you need to build a competent team. That is very, very important. So today you get business from different kinds of companies, different profiles, different customer bases, different systems. So it is important for you to see what kind of a team you need to build when you look at an internal audit practice. So you need a competent team which conforms to professional standards, internal auditing standards. And what are the key points in this? So you need to focus on attracting and retaining. Today, the biggest challenge, as I said earlier, is a war for talent. In fact, what is the kind of talent we are looking for in the next 5 years may change. What kind of talent we need for internal auditors, that may also change to some extent. But I think more and more will be IT-oriented, technology-oriented talent you need. At the same time, we also need, I think, people with good, not just communication, but also behavioral skills. There are many skills around behavior, conflict resolution, negotiation, the art of influencing. These are all very, very important besides the routine stuff like communication or listening. And so you need to build that competency as individual, and we need to have, of course, a lot of training as well. That is very, very important. Adopting professional internal audit standards and conform to it. As I mentioned earlier, the Reserve Bank has now said that the ICAI standards have to be implemented by the internal audit function in banks. So now what this means is that if you're doing a bank internal audit as a co-sourcing partner to the internal audit function, then you will also be required to look at the ICAI standards and adopt to that. It is important. It is not just the function, but also the co-sourcing partner has to do that. Of course, I think in my view, the concurrent audit is different. It is not internal audit. So to that extent, it may not apply to that, but it's only for internal audit if it is done where it goes to the audit committee and the scope is decided by them. And then as a practitioner, you are supporting the bank, because in banks you need in-house, because that is mandated by Reserve Bank of India, but they can co-source. I don't think there is any, but let's say if you're an insurance company allows independent audit firms to also to do internal audit independently. So to that extent, that can be done. So there is no issue. Just give me a minute, please. Let me just charge. So the other aspect is quality assurance. I raised this point earlier as well. You need to ensure that quality assurance and improvement is also as part of your agenda to do that. External quality assessment also can be done to see how well you're doing, but you can start with, if you're a large or a mid-sized firm, so one team can look at the other team and say how well you're done. And as I mentioned earlier, documentation is key. Very, very important to keep the right kind of documentation for every internal audit project. That's very, very important. In due course, I can tell you, in about some years to come now, 3 or 4 years, they will make it mandatory to come. So no doubt. And interestingly, I found a certain insertion in NFRA, where earlier, the NFRA probably looks at only external audit. But they have now included also internal audit by a chartered accountant only for the purpose of lack of diligence or not following the diligence. And then there is a problem with the code of ethics. So this was recently included. So it's quite strange to me that they have included only the Chartered Accountant Act and not the cost accountant as well. Let me go to point number 3, and this is the crux of what we are trying to say, is that you have to give objective assurance on matters relating to internal controls or to governance. And then you have to also give advice and insight with focus on risks that matter. The reason why we are underlined that risks that matter is sometimes auditors find something and they go to management, and then management believes that this has no relevance, it is immaterial. So I think it is very, very important to sit with management and find out, that these are the 5-6 items which is there, and constantly engage with them to find out whether they continue to remain on the radar of management or not, and then look at objectively, because tomorrow strategies may change, it may no longer be on their agenda, and then it may be a wasteful exercise. So one of the key points here when you're doing actually execution is, you must have an audit manual. It's always good to develop, even if you are part of a firm, it doesn't matter. Whether it is 20 pages or 30 pages, it's immaterial. But you must have something to guide you, so that when you have so many members doing internal audit, they must know what they are expected to do rather than leaving to their own wisdom. And of course, you need a right organization structure for delivery of internal audit. Today, you get from an FMCG, or you become the internal auditor of a FMCG company or an IT company. You must determine what kind of resources that you would need to provide that. The good part in that is, internal auditor, if you're appointed, at least you have work for for a fair amount during the year. At least you will have 4 meetings with the audit committee. So there's an expectation that you will do some audits every quarter. Although we make a plan for the whole year, and it's not necessary. It is possible that there is more work in the second quarter and third quarter, and probably a little less work in the first quarter and the last quarter. It is possible that way. But at the end of the day, the billing would be done based on the work that has been completed, and you should be in a position to have some kind of even revenues right during the year, rather than a one-time project. And generally speaking, if you're appointed for 1 year, it continues. Nobody will stop. If you're effective, if you've contributed to management in good measure and to the audit committee, there is no reason why you should not get reappointed. So absolutely, there's no reason. So in some of our businesses where we are co-sourcing, some of them were there for many years, and then only we made a change because of time. Otherwise, I don't think there was an issue. And if we had a problem with any of the co-sourcing partner in terms of their delivery, we would have an engagement with them. And in all our internal meetings or any programs that we ran together, we used to also engage them along with us as though they were part of us. So that way it helps. But I think every organization may not do that. And it is very important for an external internal auditor to understand the pulse of the organization. I think that's very, very important. Ensuring the right organization structure is, as I mentioned earlier, is very important. Allocate right profiles for the assignment. I think that's very, very important. I mentioned earlier about client expectations and regulatory compliance. I think very important, critical in banking and the financial services sector is, there are so many regulatory compliances, circulars after circulars given by the RBI and the IRDA. I think you need to have a complete understanding of all these circulars so that you're able to understand the expectation and what the management is supposed to do. And every audit is a project by itself. So you have to manage that very closely, tightly, and effectively. That's very, very important. So I think a very good escalation matrix within the team, managing their time schedules and work schedules so that you complete the project in time. That is very, very important. And of course, you continually improve yourself. Every time you do something, you have to improve yourself. There is no reason why you cannot improve. And I think everybody has to improve. We have also improved. It is not that I was born with a silver spoon right from the day one. I spent 5 years with ASEA Brown Boveri in ABB. I learned so many things there in terms of project management in a large electrical engineering company. So unless I speak their language, it is going to be very difficult for me to do my work. And so I became almost an engineer there. And then in ABG, I got the opportunity to do this in so many businesses. So I got a first-hand understanding of the business from the senior management. So we should be open to learning all the time. We must learn every day. That's very, very important. Keep an open mind, keep learning, and see what can be done. What is it that we have missed? Is it the half the glass full or half glass empty? We need to understand, is there something we can do differently and better? And so continual improvement is very important. Feedback is another thing that you can also take from others, the business. The final 2 points, there are no sub bullets here, but this is also crucial to say that you must have unrestricted access to data, information. If you're the internal auditor of the company, then you must have unrestricted access to all data, information, records. I think there is a tendency for management to withhold, not give. I think I have never followed it, even for my co-sourcing partners, wherever I had, that they always had. But sometimes companies would be a little hesitant to give certain things. But yes, you should also not be unreasonable. If it relates to the topic under audit, and I think you should get it. And a good way is to put it in a common platform, in a shared folder, so that you can access it. And then you'll have other security, information security arrangements to ensure that something is not misused or misinformed. But at the same time, I think we need unrestricted access. That is very, very important. And also the access has to be to the management, to the audit committee of the board. Management cannot say that you cannot meet so-and-so. I think that is not correct. You will, if you're the internal auditor, you have full and free access to the chairman of the audit committee. And while you will go through the executive management, it is important for you to make that happen. If you don't make that happen, then I think there is something else that you need to do to ensure that you do that. For example, one person asked me, "Sir, I don't make all the presentations to the." I said, "Are you the internal auditor of the company appointed by the board?" He said, "Yes, I am the internal auditor of the company appointed by the board, and I'm a small, medium-sized firm. But unfortunately, in the organization, I make the presentation. I prepare the presentation, but I don't deliver it in the audit committee meeting. It is the CFO who delivers it." So I said, that is actually a potential impairment to your independence. The internal auditor has the right. In fact, if you notice, the SEBI directive is he will attend the meeting and he has to present. If I have made the presentation, I'm supposed to present, not someone else. That's very clear to me. So it is important for the person to make the presentation. The internal auditor must make the presentation. If not, a partner, normally audit committees expect a partner to come and make the presentation. If for some reason the person is unwell or so, then I think the senior most person, audit director, can always go and make the presentation. And that's very, very important. I think it is crucial. You can't allow somebody else to hijack your presentation. That is actually a potential impairment. So, but you must have free access to the management and the audit committee. And at least during the meeting, either prior or after, you can always have a discussion. It's always a good thing to have a discussion with the audit committee chair. Well, that's all for me now, and I thought it's been a great 2.5 hours interacting with you. If there are any questions, I would like to take that. Thank you for a patient hearing.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your wonderful session. I'll just try to share my screen, sir. 1 minute. You can.
Shall I close this?
Yes, sir. 1 minute. Okay.
Yes.
Is my screen visible, sir? Excel sheet.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
There are 2 questions here as of now. And so will you be reading? Do you want me to?
Yeah, it's a long question, so I'll read it aloud. I would like to confirm whether internal audit focus in terms of risk assessment only with respect to accounting and audit, along with the scope of management direction towards that, which whereas the functional department, it's too long a sentence. 1 minute. Directly core functions. Okay, let me say that when we look at risk assessment, it's about every aspect of business. Every aspect of business. So the internal auditor has to focus on every aspect of business and not necessarily on the accounting and auditing aspect. And in spite of repeated reporting on this aspect, the management attitude with respect to assessment are not focused in the way it is. Yeah, so that is wrong. I think you must have a discussion with the management, and then at some point, I think you have to speak to the audit committee, because this will go against you in case something goes wrong. The most important thing to guard yourself against a future liability is actually ensure that there is adequate documentation of the scope and the work that you have done, either through minutes of meeting or directly having a dialogue with the audit committee. The audit committee is the best judge today in any of the companies, wherever the audit committee is there, which is directly having oversight of the internal audit function. The internal auditor must have a direct liaison with the audit committee, maybe through the management, it doesn't matter. But audit committee at least must be there, present. They should know exactly. Tomorrow you can't say tomorrow that, well, my scope was restricted. You can't say that tomorrow, because they will say, why didn't you tell us before? Okay. Which is the next? Management give specific direction in reporting. Then, well, I think they can't give. That's why I said you need to have your own some kind of a manual. What will be your communication philosophy? And you must discuss this with management upfront. So, for example, what we did in one of the companies was we had a 3-page note of how we will do our work for that business, and that also had some communication philosophy to say what we'll report. So somebody said, one of the members said, well, we are doing so many good things. Why don't you report that good things as well? So the question is that, can we report good things that management has done outside this area? Because tomorrow, let's say they have got ISO 31000, or they have got ISO 13000 or 8000 or 7000, something. Now, why should I comment on that? Because it has no relationship to my work, correct? So, but yes, there is a practice to say that if management has done in the required area, they've done something. One way you comment is to say, well, I don't have any significant findings in this area, which indirectly means that management has put adequate controls in place. But they cannot direct or dictate you to do certain things. They can't do that. As I said earlier, in this other case that I mentioned, the CFO was making the presentation. That should not happen. The CFO cannot make the presentation. The internal auditor who is appointed by the board has to make the presentation to the audit committee. No, the fees will go to bad debts. I think you should not worry about it. I think in principle, we have to look at integrity. We have to look at what is right, differentiate between what is right and wrong, and then take it forward. I agree that this may have a problem, but I think this will give you dividends in future. If you walk out of an audit, I can assure you it will give you dividends in the future at some point in time. Can you go down?
So those are the questions as of now, sir. Okay. And many have asked for a presentation, and it's already been shared as a link, and also with your material. And we'll be sharing again through mail also to all the registered participants with recordings of your sessions, sir. These two.
Okay,
over to for a vote of thanks, sir.
Yeah, sir, a very nice presentation, sir. I think you have showed your rich experience in this, and you have transformed it to us. We all should feel happy about it. And in the last question, no, what the person asked is forgetting about the fees and because of the management's pressure. I think I've been on the first instance, I told you about that. When I was not listened to my report, I resigned from that. That's correct to happen.
Oh, I agree.
If we are not respected, we are not being taken into account.
Correct. No, I have a couple of incidents reported to me by some CA firms, very mid-sized firms and large firms, where they have walked out of the business. Because, if you see today, we say that fees are important. So I need to somehow manage and compromise. I think in the larger run, for a professional to compromise is against our own ethics. It does affect the fees, I agree. But I don't think fees is the most important thing. Money will always come. Lakshmi will always come. Don't worry. It will come. And somewhere or the other.
And that community of sins will kill you, sir.
Yes, because tomorrow when something goes wrong, it is going to keep haunting us. Was there a way? For example, I'll give you in one of my during Diwali time, there is a practice of giving gifts, right? So in one of the companies, my audit team was there, and so what happened was the management called that audit team, two fellows, and said, well, this is the Diwali gift for you. So the good thing was, because I have done good training, so they immediately called me and they said, sir, this management is giving Diwali. This is in the normal course of business. I said, look, for internal auditor, nothing is normal course of business. You may accept gifts during Diwali and New Year or during Guru Nanak birthday. I don't have a problem. But an internal auditor will not receive any gifts at any point in time. And their duty is to report to me, because then I know what kind of management that company is, so that I can take it up to the higher authorities as well. So for example, in my time when I was there, I made it a point not to hold shares in any of the companies in the group. I don't have any share, even though I was offered as an employee. I did not have a single share in any of the companies in the group. So why did I do that? I felt that I will be relieved of that burden. Tomorrow, nobody can accuse me that saying that you had some private information about some company, and so you might have done some insider trading. So all these things can always happen. So I never did that.
That has now been brought in the law itself, no?
Yes. No, that I agree.
See, that
but
is
I'm
what
just saying
I used to say. We have the general practice of following integrity and everything. That has been derailed only during these periods. And later, I think now we'll have to go back and fix it up.
Correct. No, I agree. So this will always be with a heavy heart. We will keep it in our mind all the time. So I think sometimes if you walk away from one or two contracts, it always helps. It always helps. You will regain composure and do even better the next time. I can say that with certainty.
Like this Corona, no, you have to be alive. That is more important than to get to be contacted with the disease.
Correct.
So this is like a disease only, because that practice makes you slowly kills you.
Yes, it does. It does. Actually, people don't realize it.
It takes time, but
no, some are very subtle. See, there is a thin line. Now, sometimes people have told me that you've taken a very tough stand. It's true, but that is individual perception, individual feeling of what I should exhibit, right? But there is something like, if somebody says, like I said, if you read my article, you will know. It was a very senior person who told me, he only said that, can you change the scope from this period to the another period? Which I objected, because I got furious. How can he even talk to me like this, right? But somebody else may say, "Acha, theek hai, we can change it, no problem." So, but the fact is, it put a certain standard. So what happens is, after that, that person never spoke to me on this. We were good friends, but he never influenced me. He never thought he was influencing me. That's the best part. But I thought he was influencing me. And so I think it has never happened that somebody would tell me. So management would never they will look at our presentation, understand. They may have a view, but they will never say, don't put this slide or that slide. Never happened. So they were very clear. But audit committee can raise a point. Audit committee may say, this issue looks
wants
very...
the information there.
Yeah, I agree.
Management is interested in getting the information.
Yes. No, I agree. And I've seen many directors also, management, who openly tell, even before I tell something to the audit committee, they themselves tell. So that is very good. Why should internal auditor say something about business? Let the managing director say about it. No? So that is very good.
That's a
So
good
I think,
practice also.
yeah, excellent practice. It's a very good practice. And it was a very small amount actually. But sometimes it is the intention. It is not so much about the size of the amount. But tomorrow, small amounts can become an ocean at some time. We don't know.
See, I have seen this in certain audits, in certain cases where a small amount was omitted. It was a small
Yes.
amount. That fellow later made it as a practice and made a big money out of that.
Correct.
Like small amount was leaked, and that was made as a practice by him. And in subsequent years, he had made a huge amount. So
Yeah,
that small
absolutely.
omission in the first year to identify that the mistake, that particular mistake by the internal audit had given the big rope for him for the particular employee.
Yeah, I agree. So, for example, many years ago, I think it was 96, when I was in the other ABB group, 96, that is almost 24 years ago. The external auditors process for cash vouchers was they will check only above 5,000 rupees. Only 5,000 rupees above they will check. But fraud happened actually below 5,000. Okay. And how did this happen? Because the internal auditor went and said that I will look at 4 months, 100%.
Less than 5,000.
So exactly. So my procedure was different, right? So because we are doing it for the first time, we said, let's look at everything. You will get a complete idea of what transpires, what kind of payments, and to whom, and what the process is. So in that we got pattern, and this fraud has been going on for almost say 6-7 years. So the question is that sometimes we have to challenge our own procedures and say that
Correct.
these thresholds, are they correct or not correct? Well, today I agree there's a lot of automation and all that, so a lot of things can be done.
Like
still,
how we ask for the change in the menu.
yes, exactly. That's right.
For a better
Correct.
better intake.
Correct.
Yes, sir. Thanks for your presentation, sir. You have given a lot of inputs, demonstration integrity with the due professionalism, and you have also talked about stakeholding, expectations, and
Yes.
internal audit and the risk. About the risk, I think the risk factor. I think it can be more or less achieved by documentation, right? I think you have
Yes.
also spelled that in your last line, in your last
Yes.
concluding remarks, that data,
Yes.
access, and documentation. There you have said about this. So I think by documenting what we are supposed to do, like what you said, less than 5,000, more than 5,000. That's the principle. We can save our skin, but ultimately the achievement of the object has also to be expressed.
Absolutely.
As you say.
Absolutely.
As you say. And as you say, now it is more of IT oriented. We still agree, sir, because when I started practice in 90, nothing, there was no IT.
Correct.
So now everything is in IT. Everything is on the back of the screen.
Correct.
I think our chairman, more of a tech savvy. He gives a lot of he does everything with the technology. But as an earlier person, I'm finding it difficult to go with the technology. But still, I feel that the technology has conveyed better propositions in the process of internal audit.
Okay.
And as you say, the concurrent audit is definitely different. It is more of though it's a management information system, but it is a different one. We may not consider it as an internal audit.
No, it is not.
But what you said about the insurance corporations, sir, insurance companies.
No,
you said something about insurance company.
Yeah, insurance companies. That
is again internal audit only, no?
Yes. It's internal audit, but it can be outsourced. See, unlike Reserve Bank says that internal audit function has to be within the bank. but you
Within
can
the bank,
co-source. Yeah. So for example, today, if you take Kotak Mahindra, if you take HDFC, they all have in-house functions. State Bank, PNB, they all have in-house functions. Now, whether they are appropriately, talented and they are resourced, that's a different matter. But they can also co-source. So today, RBI has said that retired employees also you can take on contract. Retired employees, right? Now you can also
Yes,
co-source,
yes.
but their primary responsibility is
Earlier
with
it was
the
only
in-house
internal
function.
department, no?
Yeah, it has always been internal, right from the beginning in RBI. But in insurance, third party can be appointed as internal auditor. So for example, X, Y, and company chartered accountants can be appointed as internal auditor of an insurance company. Because there they have not said that it cannot be. Only if their core business cannot be outsourced. For example, actuary. Actuary cannot be outsourced, but according to them, internal audit can be outsourced. So between insurance and banks, they have a different view. They have a completely different view.
Yes, sir.
But of
Yes,
course,
sir.
Companies Act is larger, and because it is catering to so many companies. See, there are more than 1 million companies now, right? And I don't know, at least 150,000 companies will come under the threshold. That is my belief. So if 150,000 companies come under the threshold of internal audit, then you can't have everything to be done in-house, because small companies cannot afford it. So they would like to take some help from outside. So that I think is okay. But yes, so and listed companies are very few. We have only about 6 or 7,000 listed companies, not more.
Hello.
Yes.
Sir.
Can you hear?
Hello.
It seems SAR's internet connectivity is not stable, so it's restoring.
Looks like.
Yeah.
Hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it's okay. Okay, you can hear me, I guess. I hope I'm okay.
Hello. Sir.
Sir, you're audible now, so you can continue, sir, please.
Is audible now?
Yes, audible, sir. Audible.
Sir. Hello. Yes, sir. Yes. Thanks, presentation. Your advice is well taken, sir, with regard to the internal audit and the perceptions of objective of the internal audit. Advice and insight to form to focus on been well taken, yes. Sir. Thank you so much. Thank you for your nice presentation, sir. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah,
I hope the viewers have got their vision upgraded. Yeah.
Yes. I hope so too. Thank you.
Namaskar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.